In 1931, in the Kumaon Hills of British India, the hunter and naturalist Jim Corbett killed the tiger that came to be known as the Mohan man-eater, one of several big cats that had turned to hunting humans in those jungles at the time. The encounter was later described in his famous book, The Man-Eaters of Kumaon, and this is that account. Part 1. A Brave Girl Dies. 18 miles from our summer home in the Himalayas, there is a long ridge running east and west, some 9,000 feet in height. On the upper slopes of the eastern end of this ridge, there is a luxuriant growth of oat grass. Below this grass, the hill falls steeply away in a series of rock cliffs to the Kosi River below. One day, a party of women and girls from the village, situated on the northern face of the ridge, had gone out to cut this oat grass. While they were thus engaged, a tiger appeared suddenly among them. In the panic that followed, an elderly woman lost her footing upon the steep slope, rolled downward, and vanished over the edge of the cliff. The tiger, seemingly alarmed by the screams and confusion, disappeared as abruptly and as silently as it had come. When the women had gathered themselves together and in some measure recovered from their fright, they cautiously descended the grassy incline and, looking over the cliff, saw their companion lying upon a narrow ledge some distance below. The injured woman called up to them that she was badly hurt. It was later discovered that her leg was broken and several ribs fractured, and that she was unable to move. Various means of rescue were discussed, and it was eventually agreed that assistance from the men of the village would be necessary. None of the women seemed willing to remain alone at that perilous spot, and they told the injured woman that they must return to the village to fetch help. She pleaded earnestly not to be left by herself. At length, a girl of about 16 years offered to stay. Accordingly, while the remainder of the party hastened back toward the village, the girl worked her way carefully down to the right, where a cleft in the rock afforded just sufficient foothold for her to reach the ledge. The ledge extended only halfway across the face of the cliff and terminated a few yards from where the woman lay in a shallow depression. Fearing that she might slip from the narrow shelf and be dashed to pieces upon the rocks hundreds of feet below, the injured woman begged the girl to move her into the depression. This was no easy task, for the space was narrow and the footing insecure. Yet the girl succeeded in accomplishing it. There was room for only one in the depression, and so the girl remained upon the ledge itself, squatting in the manner natural to our people, facing the injured woman. The village lay 4 miles distant, and more than once the two upon that ledge tried to calculate how long it would take their companions to reach it, what men might be found there at that hour of the day, how long it would require to explain what had occurred, and finally, how much time would pass before a rescue party could arrive. Their conversation was carried on in whispers, for fear that the tiger might still be somewhere near and hear them. Suddenly, the woman gave a sharp gasp. The girl, noticing the expression of horror upon her companion's face and the direction in which she was looking, turned her head. Over her shoulder, she saw the tiger stepping quietly out from a rift in the cliff and onto the ledge. Few among us, I think, have escaped that most dreadful of nightmares in which, while our limbs and voice are held powerless by fear, a dream from which we awaken in a sweat of terror, thankful beyond words that it was only a vision. For that unfortunate girl, there was no such awakening. The scene requires little imagination. A sheer rock face with a narrow ledge, running partway across it and ending in a shallow hollow where an injured woman lies helpless. A young girl, rigid with terror, crouched upon the ledge, and a tiger advancing slowly toward her. There was no retreat, no avenue of escape, and no help within reach. At the time of this occurrence, Moti Singh, an old friend of mine, was in the village visiting a daughter who was ill. When the women arrived with their story, he took charge of the rescue party. Upon descending the grassy slope and looking over the cliff, they saw the injured woman lying in a faint, and upon the ledge there were splashes of blood. The injured woman was carried back to the village, and when she had recovered sufficiently to relate what had happened, Moti Singh set out on the 18-mile journey to inform me. Though he was well past 60 years of age, he dismissed any suggestion that he should rest before starting. We returned together to make what investigations we could, but there was nothing to be done. 24 hours had already passed, and all that remained of the brave girl who had chosen to stay with her injured companion were a few fragments of bone and her torn and blood-stained garments. This was the first human victim of the tiger that was later entered in government records under the name of the Mohan man-eater. After killing the girl, the tiger moved down into the Kosi Valley for the winter, and during its passage claimed several further victims, among them 2 employees of the Public Works Department and the daughter-in-law of our member of the Legislative Council. With the return of summer, it came back to the locality of its first kill. For some years thereafter, its range extended along the Kosi Valley from Kakrighat to Garjia, covering a stretch of approximately 40 miles. In time, it established itself on the hillside above Mohan, near a village known as Kartkanula. At a district conference, the 3 man-eating tigers then active within the Kumaon division were classified in order of importance, as follows. First, Chaugar, in the Nainital district. Second, Mohan, in the Almora district. Third, Kanda, in the Garhwal district. When the Chaugar tiger had been dealt with, I was reminded that my undertaking at the conference had only been partially fulfilled, and that the Mohan tiger stood next upon the list. Part 2. Journey to Kartkanula. It was on a blisteringly hot day in May that I, accompanied by my 2 servants and the 6 Garhwalis whom I had brought with me from Nainital, stepped down from the train at Ramnagar and set out upon the 25-mile march on foot to Kartkanula. It was not until evening that we reached Garjia. Making a very early start on the following morning, we covered the 12 miles to Mohan before the sun had gathered strength, while my men were engaged in cooking their meal and preparing my breakfast. The bungalow chowkidar, 2 forest guards, and several men from the Mohan Bazaar gathered round and entertained me with accounts of the man-eater's activities. The most recent story concerned the experience of a fisherman who had been at work along the Kosi River. One of the forest guards present claimed with evident pride to have played the leading part in the episode. In a very graphic manner, he described how, on a certain day, he had gone down to the river with the fishermen, and how, on rounding a bend, they had suddenly found themselves face to face with the man-eater. The fisherman, according to his version of events, had instantly thrown aside his rod, seized the rifle from the god's shoulder, and fled, and the 2 of them had run for their lives, with the tiger following close behind. "Did you look back?" I asked. "No, Sahib," he replied, with a look that suggested pity for my ignorance. How could a man who was running for his life from a man-eater look back? The fisherman, who had been leading by a narrow margin, had, it appeared, fallen headlong over a sleeping bear that was lying in a thick patch of grass. After this, there had been much shouting and confusion, and everyone concerned, including the bear, had gone off in different directions. The fisherman had lost his way and was missing for some time. Eventually, after a long interval, he had found his way back to the bungalow. On his return, he had had much to say to the forest guard regarding the latter's conduct in allowing him to run off with the rifle and leave him to face a man-eating tiger and an angry bear without a weapon. The guard concluded his recital by stating that the fisherman had left Mohan on the following day. The explanation given was that he had injured his leg in falling over the bear, and that in any case there were no fish worth catching in the Kosi River. By midday, we were ready to continue our journey, after receiving many warnings from the small gathering of men to keep a sharp lookout for the man-eater while passing through the dense forest ahead. We began the 4,000-foot climb to Kartkanula. Our progress was necessarily slow. The loads carried by my men were heavy. the track steep in the extreme and the heat oppressive. There had recently been some disturbance in the upper villages which had required the dispatch of a small police force from Nainital. I had therefore been advised to carry with me all that I and my men might require, as, owing to the unsettled state of affairs, no supplies could be obtained locally. This accounted for the weight of the loads my men were bearing. Late in the afternoon, when there was no longer any danger to be apprehended for my men from the man-eater, I left them and proceeded alone toward the forester's hut, which is visible from Mohan and in which I intended to stay during my time at Kartkanula. The hut stands upon the ridge of the high hill overlooking Mohan. I approached it by the level stretch of road that runs across the face of the hillside, turning a corner in a small ravine where dense undergrowth grew. I came upon a woman filling an earthenware pitcher from a thin trickle of water that ran down a wooden trough. Realizing that my silent approach in rubber-soled shoes might startle her, I coughed to announce my presence. She started violently at the sound. A few yards beyond her, I stopped and lit a cigarette. After a minute or two, without turning my head, I asked whether it was safe for anyone to be alone in so lonely a spot. After a brief hesitation, she replied that it was not safe, but that water had to be fetched, and as there was no one at home to accompany her, she had come alone. "Was there no man?" I asked. "Yes, there was a man," she said, "but he was in the fields, ploughing, and in any case, it was the duty of the women to fetch water. How long would it take to fill the pitcher? Only a little longer." By this time, her first alarm and shyness had passed, and I found myself subjected to a thorough questioning. Was I a policeman? No. A forest officer? No. Then who was I? Just a man. Why had I come? To try and help the people of Kartkanula. In what manner? By shooting the man-eater. Where had I heard of it? Why had I come alone? Where were my men? How many were there? How long would I remain? And so the questioning continued. The pitcher was not declared full until her curiosity had been satisfied. As she followed behind me along the road, she pointed to one of several ridges that ran down the southern face of the hill. Indicating a large tree standing upon a grassy slope, she informed me that 3 days earlier the man-eater had killed a woman beneath it. The tree, which I noted with interest, lay no more than 200 or 300 yards from the forester's hut. That was my objective. We had by then reached a footpath that led up the hill. As she turned onto it, the woman told me that her village lay just round the shoulder of the hill and added that she was now safe. By waiting while she filled her pitcher and by answering her questions, I had secured a friend who would in the shortest possible time inform the entire village of my arrival and make it known that I had come with the intention of freeing them from the man-eater. Part 3. The Forester's Hut. The forester's hut stood upon a small knoll some 20 yards to the left of the road. Finding the door secured only by a chain, I unfastened it and entered. The room measured roughly 10 feet square and, though clean, carried a stale and moldy odor. I learned later that the hut had remained unoccupied since the man-eater had first appeared in that locality some 18 months earlier. On either side of the main room were 2 narrow compartments, one serving as a kitchen and the other as a store for fuel. The hut would provide secure shelter for my men. After opening the rear door to allow air to circulate through the interior, I stepped outside and selected a level patch between the hut and the road upon which to pitch my tent. Having done so, I seated myself upon a rock near the roadside to await the arrival of my men. I had not been there more than 10 minutes when a head rose cautiously above the crest from the direction of the village, followed shortly by another and then a third. The woman I had met at the water trough had clearly lost no time in spreading news of my arrival. When my servants came up and I indicated where I proposed to have my tent erected, a murmur of alarm arose among the villagers who had now assembled. To live in a tent, they protested, was folly. Was I unaware that a man-eating tiger haunted the area and that it passed along this very road each night? If I doubted them, they urged me to inspect the claw marks upon doors at the upper end of the village where the road ran between the houses. Moreover, even if I escaped harm in the tent, my men in the hut would certainly be taken unless I remained to protect them. At this, my men added their entreaties to those of the villagers. In the end, I consented to occupy the main room of the hut, while my 2 servants took the kitchen and the 6 garwales made themselves quarters in the fuel store. The subject of the tiger having thus been introduced without effort on my part, I was free to pursue it without betraying that it had been foremost in my mind from the moment the first villager appeared over the ridge. I was informed that the road by which the tiger traveled nightly ran eastward to Baital Ghat, with a branch descending to Mohan, and westward to Chaknakal on the Ramganga River, proceeding west. The road passed through the upper portion of the village and across cultivated fields for about half a mile before turning south along the hillside. Regaining the ridge on which the hut stood, it then followed that ridge down to Chaknakal. The stretch between Kartkanula and Chaknakal, some 6 miles in length, was regarded as especially dangerous and had been abandoned since the arrival of the man-eater. Later, I found that beyond the cultivated land, the track entered dense timber and scrub jungle, which continued uninterrupted to the river below. The principal cultivation of Kartkanula lies upon the northern face of the hill. Beyond these fields rise several minor ridges divided by deep ravines. On the nearest of these ridges, at a distance of roughly 1,000 yards from the hut, stands a large pine tree. Beneath this tree, about 10 days before my arrival, the tiger had killed a woman, partly devoured her, and left the remains. 3 sportsmen who were staying in a forest bungalow some 4 miles distant had attempted to secure the tiger, being unable to climb the pine. The villagers had erected 3 machan in separate trees at distances varying between 100 and 150 yards from the kill. The machan had been occupied by the sportsmen and their attendants shortly before sunset. A young moon was then visible, and after it had set, the villagers heard several shots. On questioning the servants the following morning, they learned that nothing definite had been seen at the time the shots were fired. 2 days later, a cow had been killed, over which the sportsmen again took their vigil, as before. Shots were discharged after the moon had gone down. It is these well-meant but unsuccessful efforts to destroy man-eaters that render them increasingly wary, and the longer such animals survive, the more difficult they become to approach. The villagers supplied me with one additional and particularly interesting detail. They asserted that they could always tell when the tiger entered the village by a low moaning sound it uttered. On close questioning, I gathered that at times this sound continued steadily as the animal passed between the houses, while at other times it ceased for intervals, sometimes brief, sometimes prolonged. From this information, I formed certain conclusions. First, that the tiger was suffering from an injury. Second, that the injury troubled it chiefly while in motion. And third, that the wound was most likely situated in one of its legs. I was assured that no local shikari nor any of the sportsmen from Raniket had wounded the animal. The exact source of the injury was, however, of secondary importance. The tiger had long been a man-eater, and it was possible that the wound I suspected had been the original cause of its turning to human prey. This was a question that could only be resolved upon examination of the animal after it was dead. Part 4. Tracking. While passing through Ramnagar, I had requested the Tahsildar to purchase for me 2 young male buffaloes and to have them sent on to Mohan, where my men would take charge of them. I informed the villagers that my intention was to tie 1 buffalo near the tree under which the woman had been killed 3 days earlier, and the second on the road leading to Chaknakal. They could suggest no more suitable positions, though they proposed to discuss the matter among themselves and give me their opinion in the morning, should any better site occur to them. Darkness was approaching, and before departing, the headman undertook to send word to neighboring villages at first light. informing them of my arrival and urging that I be notified without delay of any fresh kills or attacks within their boundaries. The mustiness in the hut had diminished, though it was still perceptible. I disregarded it, and after bathing and dining, placed stones against the doors, there being no other means of securing them, and, being thoroughly fatigued from the day's exertions, lay down and slept. I am a light sleeper, and some hours later was awakened by the sound of an animal moving in the jungle. It approached close to the rear door, taking up a rifle and torch. I shifted the stone aside with my foot and opened the door, at which the creature withdrew. From the sound, it might have been the tiger. It might equally have been a leopard or even a porcupine. The undergrowth, however, was too dense to permit identification. Returning inside and replacing the stone, I became aware of a soreness in my throat, which I attributed to having sat in the wind after the hot march from Mohan. When my servant entered at dawn with tea, I discovered that I was suffering from an acute inflammation of the throat. The cause was possibly the long unused hut, whose roof I now noticed to be thick with bats. My servant reported that he and his companion were unaffected, though the 6 Garhwalis sleeping in the fuel store had developed similar symptoms. My medical resources were limited to a small bottle of iodine, a few quinine tablets, and a packet of permanganate crystals. I prepared a gargle of hot water with a liberal measure of permanganate and some iodine. The mixture proved powerful, blackening our teeth, but providing considerable relief. After breakfast, I dispatched 4 men to Mohan to bring up the buffaloes, and went myself to examine the site where the woman had been killed, guided by the directions received the previous evening. I found the place without difficulty. The grass she had been tying lay where it had fallen, as did the rope she had been using. 2 additional bundles, abandoned by her companions in their flight, were also still there. I had been told that her body had not been recovered, from the fact that 3 serviceable lengths of rope and the woman's sickle remained undisturbed in the jungle. I concluded that no serious attempt had been made to search for her. The attack had occurred at the upper edge of a small landslip. From there the tiger had dragged the woman down the slide into thick cover. It appeared to have waited for some time, perhaps until the remaining women were safely out of sight, before crossing the ridge visible from the hut and descending with its kill for over a mile into dense jungle. The tracks were by then 4 days old, and as nothing further was to be gained from following them, I returned to the hut, expecting the buffaloes only by evening. I set out after luncheon to examine the road toward Chucknuckle. From the hut, the hillside rises gradually for some 500 feet and is roughly triangular. The road, after traversing cultivated ground for half a mile, bends sharply left and crosses a steep, rocky spur before regaining the ridge. There, it turns right and follows the crest downward to Chucknuckle. For a short distance, the road remains level upon the ridge, after which it descends sharply, in places, by means of hairpin bends. With the afternoon before me, I examined nearly 3 miles of the road with care. A tiger that habitually uses a road invariably leaves scratch marks along its edges. These marks, serving the same purpose as those made by domestic cats and other members of the feline family, are of considerable value to the sportsman. From them one may determine whether the animal is male or female, the direction in which it was traveling, the time that has elapsed since it passed, the probable direction and distance of its headquarters, the character of its kills, and even whether it has recently fed upon human flesh. The usefulness of such information to one hunting a man-eater in unfamiliar country needs no emphasis. Pug marks left upon roads yield further data: the animal's direction and pace, its gender and approximate age, and whether any limb is defective. Owing to long neglect, the road was overgrown with short, stiff grass, an excellent medium for recording pug marks. Near the point where the road reached the ridge lay a damp patch, and just below it a stagnant green pool that served as a regular drinking place for sambar. I discovered several scratch marks shortly beyond the bend where the road left the cultivated land. The newest of them, 3 days old. About 200 yards farther on part of the roadway, passed beneath an overhanging rock. The rock stood some 10 feet high, and above it lay a narrow grassy platform, visible only to those approaching from the village side. Upon the ridge I found additional scratch marks, though no clear pug marks until I reached the first hairpin bend. There, where the tiger had cut across the curve and dropped onto soft earth, I found tracks a day old. Though slightly blurred, they were sufficient to show that they had been made by a large and aged male. In country inhabited by a man-eater, movement must necessarily be slow. Every bush, rock, tree, or unevenness in the ground capable of concealing danger must be approached with caution. Where no wind is blowing, and that evening there was none. One must also maintain constant vigilance behind and to either side, yet there was much to observe. It was May, and at this elevation of 4,000 to 5,000 feet, the orchids were in full bloom. I have seldom seen greater profusion. The white butterfly orchid appeared everywhere, and nearly every substantial tree seemed adorned with it. Guarding my back, watching for sign, and taking in the jungle sounds and color, the afternoon passed quickly. As the sun declined, I found myself once more near the overhanging rock. Of all the ground I had covered, this struck me as the most dangerous point. A tiger lying upon the grassy shelf above would need only to wait until a traveler passed beneath or just beyond it to secure him at its leisure. It was a position that required remembering. On my return to the hut, I found the buffaloes had arrived, though it was too late to place them that evening. My servants had maintained a fire throughout the day, and the air within was now fresh. Nevertheless, I did not intend to risk another night in a sealed room. 2 thorn bushes were cut and firmly wedged into the doorways before I retired. There was no disturbance in the jungle near the rear door that night, and after sound sleep I awoke in the morning with my throat greatly improved. Part 5. An Adventure. I spent the greater part of the morning in talking with the villagers, and in listening to the many accounts they had to give of the man-eater and of the various attempts that had been made to shoot it. After luncheon, I tied one buffalo upon the small ridge across which the tiger had carried the woman, and the second at the hairpin bend, where I had previously observed the pug marks. On the following morning, I found both animals lying asleep, having eaten nearly all of the large supply of grass I had placed before them. I had fastened bells round the necks of each buffalo, and the fact that I heard no sound from these bells as I approached gave me 2 brief disappointments. For, as I have said, I found both animals undisturbed and sleeping. That evening, I altered the position of the second buffalo, moving it from the hairpin bend to the place where the road emerged upon the ridge near the stagnant pool. The methods most commonly employed in shooting tigers are generally of 2 kinds. Either one sits up over a kill, or one organizes a beat. And in both cases, young male buffaloes are used as bait. The usual practice is to select ground suitable for the purpose, whether for a machan or for driving the cover, and toward evening, to tie out the bait with a rope strong enough to hold the buffalo, yet such as a tiger can break. When the bait is taken, the hunter either takes his place over the kill in a tree, or arranges for the cover into which the tiger has dragged its victim to be beaten. In the present circumstances, neither of these methods was practicable, although my throat was very much improved. It remained sufficiently sore to make it impossible for me to sit through the night without coughing. A beat over that vast extent of heavily wooded and broken country would have been hopeless, even had I been able to command 1,000 men. I therefore decided to stalk the tiger, and with this object in view, I secured each buffalo carefully to stout saplings by means of 4 hemp ropes of 1 inch thickness, leaving them out in the jungle continuously throughout the 24 hours. Thereafter, I stalked the buffaloes in turn each morning, as soon as there was light enough to shoot by. and again in the evening before dusk. Tigers, whether man-eaters or otherwise, kill as readily by day as by night in areas where they are not disturbed, during the hours of daylight. While I waited for news from the surrounding villages, I rested and nursed my throat, and my 6 Garhwalis attended to feeding and watering the buffaloes. On the 4th evening, as I was returning at sunset after visiting the buffalo tied upon the ridge, I came round a bend in the road some 30 yards short of the overhanging rock. At that moment, and for the first time since my arrival at Kartkanula, I became suddenly and strongly conscious that I was in danger, and that the danger which threatened me lay upon the rock ahead. For fully 5 minutes I stood absolutely motionless, my eyes fixed upon the upper edge of the rock and watching intently for the slightest movement. At that short distance, even the flicker of an eyelid would have been sufficient to attract my notice. Yet there was no movement of any kind. Advancing some 10 paces, I halted again and resumed my watch for several minutes more. The absence of visible movement did not reassure me in the least. I felt certain that the man-eater was lying above me, and the problem to be decided was how best to deal with the situation. The hillside was exceedingly steep, broken by projecting rocks and covered with long grass, trees, and thick scrub jungle. Had it been earlier in the day, I would have retraced my steps and worked round above the tiger in an attempt to secure a shot from higher ground. But with not more than half an hour of daylight remaining, and nearly a mile yet to cover before reaching the hut, it would have been sheer madness to leave the road. Slipping forward the safety catch and bringing my rifle to the shoulder, I prepared to pass the rock. The road at that point was approximately 8 feet in width, keeping to the extreme outer edge. I moved sideways, almost crab fashion, feeling each step carefully before placing my full weight upon it, so as to avoid stepping into space. My progress was necessarily slow and deliberate, as I drew level with the overhanging rock and began to edge past it. For a moment I entertained the hope that the tiger might remain where he was until I had reached that portion of the road from which the grassy platform above the rock would become visible. The tiger, however, having failed to take me by surprise, was not prepared to run unnecessary risks. I had scarcely cleared the rock when a low, muttered growl sounded from above me. A little later a kakur, the small barking deer of these hills, whose sharp call so often betrays the presence of a leopard or tiger, began barking urgently to the right. And shortly afterward 2 hind sambar, the great jungle deer of these hills, were heard belling near the crest of the triangular hill, their deep alarm notes carrying far to warn others of danger. The tiger had withdrawn with a sound skin, but for that matter, so had I, and there was therefore no cause for regret. From the position indicated by the sambar, I felt confident that he would hear the bell suspended from the neck of the buffalo tied upon the ridge near the stagnant pool. On reaching the cultivated land, I found a small group of men waiting for me. They had heard the kakar and the sambar, and were disappointed that I had not secured a shot. But their spirits improved when I told them that I had reason to hope for better fortune on the following day. During the night, a dust storm arose, followed by heavy rain, and to my discomfort, I discovered that the roof of the hut was extremely porous. After some shifting of my camp bed to a spot where the leakage was less severe, I resumed my sleep. When I awoke, the morning was brilliantly clear. The rain had washed the dust and heat haze from the atmosphere, and every leaf and blade of grass glistened in the light of the newly risen sun. Part 6. The tiger kills a buffalo. Until now, I had made it my practice to visit the nearer of the 2 buffaloes first. But on this particular morning, I felt a strong inclination to reverse the usual order. Accordingly, instructing my men to remain where they were until the sun had risen well above the horizon, and then to proceed to feed and water the nearer buffalo, I set out with high expectations down the Chaknakal road. Before leaving the hut, I had taken care to clean and oil my rifle, a weapon of great efficiency and one that had proved a reliable and faithful companion to me for many years. The overhanging rock, which I had passed with such difficulty on the previous evening, caused me no uneasiness. Now, the events of the night had altered the situation, and my mind was occupied with other possibilities. Having passed the rock, I began to look carefully for tracks, for the rain of the night before had softened the surface of the road and rendered it favorable for impressions for some distance. However, I observed nothing. It was only when I reached the damp patch of ground, which lies on the near side of the ridge, and not far from the stagnant pool beside which the buffalo had been tied, that I saw the pug marks of the tiger. These tracks had been made before the storm had broken, and they were heading in the direction of the ridge. Close to this damp patch, there is a rock some 3 feet in height on the hood side of the road. On earlier occasions, when stalking down this road, I had discovered that by standing upon this rock, I could look over a slight rise in the track and see the buffalo, tied some 40 yards beyond. I now climbed quietly onto the rock and raised my head with caution. To my astonishment, the buffalo was no longer there. This discovery was at once disturbing and difficult to explain. In order to prevent the tiger from dragging the buffalo into some remote portion of the jungle, where the only chance of securing a shot would have been by sitting up either on the ground or in a tree, an impracticable course, given the state of my throat, I had fastened the animal with 4 strands of stout hemp rope, each rope being of 1 inch thickness. Despite these precautions, the tiger had succeeded in carrying off the kill. I was wearing the thinnest rubber-soled shoes, and moving without sound, I approached the sapling to which the buffalo had been secured. Examining the ground carefully, I found that the animal had been killed before the storm, but that it had been carried away only after the rain had ceased, and without any portion of it having been eaten. 3 of the ropes which I had twisted together had been gnawed through, and the 4th had been broken. Tigers do not, as a rule, gnaw through ropes. Yet this one had done so, and had taken the buffalo down the slope facing Mohan. My arrangements had been seriously upset, yet, in a most fortunate manner, the rain had come to my assistance. The thick carpet of dead leaves, which on the previous day had been as dry and brittle as tinder, were now damp and pliable. Provided I committed no error, the very pains the tiger had taken to secure his kill might, in the end, prove to be the cause of his undoing. Whenever I enter jungle in which rapid shooting may at any instant become necessary, I never feel entirely at ease until I have satisfied myself that my rifle is properly loaded to pull a trigger in an emergency, and discover too late that one has neglected to load the weapon would be an act of carelessness for which no justification could ever be offered. Though I knew that I had loaded my rifle before passing the overhanging rock, I, nevertheless, opened it and withdrew the cartridges. 1 cartridge, being discolored and slightly dented, I replaced. After working the safety catch backward and forward several times to ensure that it moved freely, for I have never made a practice of carrying a cocked weapon, I closed the rifle and prepared to follow the drag. The term drag, when used to describe the mark left upon the ground by a tiger moving its kill, is somewhat misleading. A tiger, when transporting its prey for any distance, and I have known one to carry a full-grown cow for 4 miles, does not, in the strict sense, drag it. It carries it. If the animal is too heavy to be carried, it is abandoned. The appearance of a drag mark depends upon the size of the prey and the manner in which it is held. For example, if a sambar is carried by the neck, the hindquarters trail upon the ground and leave a clear and continuous mark. If, however, it is held by the middle of the back, there may be only a faint trace or possibly none at all. In the present instance, the tiger had seized the buffalo by the neck, and the hindquarters, trailing upon the ground, left a distinct and easily followed drag mark. For some 100 yards, the tiger had moved diagonally across the face of the hill until he reached a steep clay bank. In attempting to cross this bank, he had slipped, and in so doing had been compelled to relinquish his hold upon the buffalo. The carcass had then rolled down the slope for 30 or 40 yards before coming to rest against a tree. Upon regaining the kill, the tiger had altered his grip and taken it by the middle of the back. From this point onward, only one leg occasionally brushed the ground, leaving but a faint indication of the path. Even so, the hillside being thickly covered with bracken, it was not difficult to follow the course. During his fall, the tiger appeared to have lost his sense of direction, for thereafter his movements suggested indecision. He went first some 200 yards to the right, then 100 yards directly downhill through a dense growth of ringles. After forcing his way, not without effort, through this thicket, he turned to the left and moved diagonally across the hillside for several 100 yards until he reached a large rock, which he skirted on the right. This rock lay flush with the ground on the side from which I approached it, and rose gently for perhaps 20 feet, appearing at its far end to project over a hollow of some extent. If there had been a cave or recess beneath that projection, it would have afforded an excellent place for the tiger to conceal his kill. Leaving the drag, I stepped upon the rock and advanced very slowly, examining with the utmost care every yard of ground below and to either side as it came into view. On reaching the end of the projection and looking down, I found, to my disappointment, that the hillside rose steeply to meet the rock. There was no cave and no recess beneath it, such as I had anticipated. As the point of the rock commanded a clear view of the dell and of the surrounding jungle and was, comparatively speaking, secure against a sudden rush from the man-eater, I seated myself upon it. In the act of doing so, my eye was caught by a red and white object in a dense patch of low undergrowth, some 40 or 50 yards directly below me. When one is searching for a tiger in heavy jungle, any patch of red that arrests the eye is at once assumed to be the tiger himself. In this case, not only did I see what appeared to be the red of the animal, but I could distinguish what seemed unmistakably to be his stripes. For a full minute, I watched the object without moving. Then, as sometimes happens when one studies a freak picture in which a face is concealed and suddenly becomes clear, the illusion resolved itself. The object before me was not the tiger at all, but the kill. The red that had deceived me was blood where the tiger had recently fed, and the stripes were the ribs from which he had torn away the hide. I was thankful that I had restrained myself for that minute and had not fired. In a somewhat similar incident, a friend of mine had lost his chance of securing a very fine tiger by firing 2 shots into a kill over which he had intended to sit up. Fortunately for all concerned, he was an accurate shot. The 2 men whom he had sent forward to locate the kill and erect a machan above it, and who at the moment he fired were standing near the carcass screened by a bush, escaped injury. Part 7. Change of position. When a tiger that has not been disturbed leaves his kill in the open, it may reasonably be assumed that he is lying close at hand, guarding it from vultures and other scavengers. The fact that I could not see him did not in the least imply that he was not somewhere in the dense cover nearby. Tigers are greatly troubled by flies, and seldom remain long in one position. I therefore decided to remain where I was and watch patiently for movement. Hardly, however, had I reached this resolution when I became aware of a renewed irritation in my throat. I had not fully recovered from my recent attack of laryngitis, and the irritation increased steadily until it became clear that I must either cough or suffer considerably. The usual expedients employed on such occasions, whether in church or in jungle, such as holding one's breath and swallowing forcibly, proved ineffective. It became a choice between coughing outright and attempting some other means of relief. In desperation, I endeavored to ease my throat by imitating the alarm call of the langur. Sounds are not easily rendered into words. Yet for those unfamiliar with our jungles, I may attempt some description of this call, which can be heard for a considerable distance, often for half a mile or more. It is a sharp, repeated bark-like note delivered at short and urgent intervals, rising at the end into a harsh and prolonged outburst that carries clearly across hill and valley. What you will hear now is the alarm call of the langur. Not all langurs give the alarm at the sight of a tiger, but those inhabiting our hills most certainly do. This tiger had probably heard that call on countless occasions throughout his life, and it was therefore the one sound I could venture to make without arousing suspicion. My own rendering of it in that moment was far from perfect. Nevertheless, it served its purpose, and the irritation in my throat subsided. For the next half hour I remained seated upon the rock, watching intently for any movement and listening carefully to the voices of the jungle. When I was satisfied that the tiger was not within range of my vision, I descended from the rock and, moving with the utmost caution, approached the kill. I regret that I cannot state with precision the quantity of flesh a full-grown tiger can consume at a single meal. Some idea of his capacity may be gathered from the fact that he can dispose of a sambar within 2 days, and of a buffalo within 3, possibly leaving only a small portion for a 4th day. The buffalo I had tied out was not fully grown, though by no means a small animal, and the tiger had eaten roughly half of it. After such a meal I felt certain that he could not have traveled far, as the ground remained damp and would continue so for another hour or 2. I resolved to ascertain the direction in which he had gone and, if possible, to stalk him. There was a confusion of tracks about the kill, but by working in gradually widening circles, I was able to discover the spoor he had made on leaving. Soft-footed animals are more difficult to track than those with hard hooves. Yet, after many years of practice, tracking demands no more conscious effort than that required by a well-trained gun dog following a scent. Moving as silently and as deliberately as a shadow, I took up the trail, knowing that the tiger must be somewhere close at hand. After proceeding some 100 yards, I came upon a small, flat space, about 20 feet square, carpeted with a short, soft variety of grass, whose roots possessed a strong scent. Upon this grass the tiger had lain, and the impression of his body was clearly marked. While I was examining this imprint and forming an estimate of the size of the animal that had made it, I observed several of the blades of grass, which had been pressed flat, slowly rising upright again. This indicated that the tiger had vacated the spot no more than a minute or 2 before my arrival. The relative positions of the ground may best be understood by stating that the tiger had brought the kill down from the north, and on leaving it had moved westward. The rock upon which I had been sitting, the kill itself, and the spot where I now stood formed the 3 points of a triangle, one side measuring some 40 yards, and the other 2 approximately 100 yards each. My first thought, on seeing the grass resume its upright position, was that the tiger had observed me and withdrawn. This, however, I soon dismissed, for neither the rock nor the kill was visible from the grass plot, and I was equally certain that he had not seen me after I had taken up the trail. So, why then had he abandoned so comfortable a resting place? The answer presented itself as I felt the sun upon the back of my neck. It was now about 9 o'clock on an oppressively hot morning in May. A glance at the sun and at the tops of the trees over which it had risen showed that its rays had been falling upon the grass for some 10 minutes. The tiger had evidently found the position too warm and had shifted a few minutes before my arrival in search of shade. The grass plot, as I have said, was roughly 20 feet square. On the far side, opposite the direction from which I had approached, lay a fallen tree running north and south. The trunk, about 4 feet in diameter, rested with its root end against the steep hillside, which at that point rose sharply and was overgrown with brushwood. The branch end snapped when the tree fell, projected outward over the slope. Beyond the trunk, the hillside appeared nearly perpendicular, and across its face ran a narrow ledge of rock, disappearing into dense jungle some 30 yards away. If my supposition that the tiger had shifted position because of the sun was correct, there could be no more suitable shelter than the lee side of the fallen tree. The only way to satisfy myself was to approach the trunk and look over it. At that moment, a picture I had seen many years before in Punch came vividly to mind. It depicted a solitary sportsman who had gone out to hunt lions and who, glancing upward at a rock he was passing, found himself face to face with the grinning countenance of the largest lion in Africa. Beneath the illustration were the words, "When you go out looking for a lion, be quite sure that you want to see him." In my own case, there would be this small difference. Whereas the sportsman in Africa looked up into the lion's face, I would be looking down into the tiger's. Otherwise, assuming that the tiger lay beyond the fallen tree, the situations would be very much alike. Part 8. Success at last. Slipping my feet forward inch by inch over the soft grass, I began to edge toward the fallen tree. I had covered roughly half the distance between myself and it when my eye was caught by a small black and yellow object, some 3 inches in length, lying upon the narrow, rocky ledge beyond. I now perceived that this ledge was a well-used game path. For a full minute I kept my gaze fixed upon that motionless object until I satisfied myself that it was the tip of the tiger's tail. If the tail pointed away from me, then the head must necessarily be turned in my direction. The ledge appeared to be no more than 2 feet in width, and if the tiger were crouching there, he could only be lying low, ready to spring the instant my head rose above the bole of the tree. The tip of the tail lay some 20 feet from where I stood, allowing 8 feet for the tiger's length, while crouched his head would therefore be no more than 12 feet distant. I should, however, be obliged to approach still nearer, before enough of his body came into view to enable me to deliver a crippling shot, and a crippling shot what it must be if I wished to leave that spot upon my own feet. At that moment, and for the first time in my life, I regretted my long-standing habit of carrying my rifle uncocked. The safety catch of my .450-400 gives out a very distinct click when released. To make any sound now would either bring the tiger down upon me in a flash, or send him crashing down the precipitous hillside without affording me the slightest chance of a shot. Inch by inch, I again started to creep forward, until the entire length of the tail came into view. And then, slowly, the hindquarters. When these were fully visible, I could have cried out with relief, for they showed plainly that the tiger was not crouched and ready to spring, but lying extended at ease. The ledge being too narrow to accommodate his full length, he had stretched his hind legs backward and was resting them upon the upper branches of an oak sapling that grew up the face of the steep hillside. Another foot forward brought his belly into sight, and from the steady rise and fall of it I knew that he was asleep. With rather less caution now, though still with care, I edged forward until his shoulder, and then his whole body, lay exposed before me. The back of his head rested upon the edge of the grass plot that extended 3 or 4 feet beyond the fallen tree. His eyes were tightly closed, and his nose was pointed skyward, bringing the sights of the rifle to bear upon his forehead. I pressed the trigger and, maintaining steady pressure, at the same time pushed forward the safety catch. I had no certainty how this reversal of the customary order of firing would operate, but it did operate. The heavy bullet, at that short distance, struck him squarely in the forehead, and not so much as a tremor passed through his body. His tail remained extended, his hind legs continued to rest upon the branches of the sapling, and his nose still pointed toward the sky. Nor was there the slightest alteration in his posture when I dispatched a second, wholly unnecessary bullet into him. The only visible change was that his belly no longer rose and fell, and that blood was trickling down from 2 remarkably small holes in his forehead. I cannot say how the close presence of a tiger affects other men, but in my own case, it invariably leaves me somewhat breathless, whether from excitement, from fear, or from a mixture of both I cannot determine, and with a desire to sit down for a little while. I seated myself upon the fallen tree and lit the cigarette I had denied myself since my throat had first become troublesome, and allowed my thoughts to wander. There was satisfaction in any task well accomplished, and the one just completed was no exception. The purpose for which I had come to that spot was the destruction of the man-eater. From the moment I left the road 2 hours earlier until the instant I pushed forward the safety catch, everything, including the improvised langur call, had worked smoothly and without a single fault. In that, there was real satisfaction of the kind, I imagine, an author must feel when he writes finis at the end of a story that has unfolded, stage by stage, exactly as he intended. And yet, in one respect, the ending was not wholly satisfactory. I had killed the animal that lay not 5 feet from me while he slept. My personal feelings in the matter may be of little consequence to others. Nevertheless, I cannot help thinking that some might consider the act less than sporting. I tried to reason the matter out with myself. The tiger was a confirmed man-eater, and far better dead than alive. Whether he was awake or asleep at the moment of his death could make no real difference to those whose lives he threatened. And had I walked away when I saw his belly rising and falling, I should thereafter have borne a measure of responsibility for every human life he might have taken. These reflections were logical enough, and difficult to dispute. Yet the regret remains that, whether from fear of what might happen to me if I attempted to rouse him, or from fear of losing perhaps the only opportunity I should ever have, or from some mixture of both, I did not awaken the sleeping animal and give him what might be called a sporting chance. When later I began the work of skinning the tiger, I noticed that much of the hair on the inner side of his left foreleg was missing, and that the skin there was pierced in many places from which a yellow fluid was slowly oozing. As the skin came away from the flesh, I drew out one after another a number of porcupine quills, the longest of them measuring nearly 5 inches in length. In all, there was somewhere between 25 and 30. The flesh beneath the skin, from the tiger's chest down to the pad of the foot, was of a dark yellow color and had a soft, almost soapy consistency. It was clear that such injuries must have caused the animal great pain whenever he moved, and they were more than sufficient to explain the low moaning sound the villagers had spoken of when the tiger passed through the village at night. They also explained why he had first turned to human prey, and why he had continued to live as a man-eater.